Chapter 19. Dances with Ponies. All the attention at his new school made Eddie lonesome for his old school and his old friends. One friend in particular was a cute, brown-haired girl named Debbie Donahue. She had a big-eyed little sister named Bama that was a good friend of Jimmy's. So when the boys acquired a couple of ponies for their new farm, it wasn't that surprising that Eddie and Jimmy asked to ride them to visit their girlfriends. "So, where do these girls live?" asked their mom. "Up Printer Holler," answered Eddie. "Isn't that about 7 miles from here?" she asked, with a dubious look on her face. "Yes, but it'll be a little shorter if we take the train tracks." To this day, Eddie wonders what convinced his mother to let them go. But she did. They had no saddles for the ponies, and those ponies' backs were as bony as a skeleton. As they rode along the side of the tracks, Eddie motivated Jimmy by reminding him just how cute little Bama was, and Jimmy did the same for Eddie. After a couple of hours, the boys stiffly dismounted in the Donahue yard to the amazement of Debbie and Bama. The girls weren't nearly as excited to see the boys as Eddie had hoped they'd be. Perhaps it was because they smelled so strongly of sweat, both boy and pony. Perhaps it was because they could hardly move. Anyway, they had to turn around and head home before the sun got too low. The ride back was murder, and not just on the ponies. There were no pictures of Debbie and Bama dancing in the boys' heads to urge them on. There were only the blisters growing where the saddles should have been. A 7-mile trip up the holler was turning into a 14-mile nightmare. Just as the last bit of daylight faded from the sky, Eddie and Jimmy dragged themselves up the hill. They limped into the house and collapsed around the kitchen table. "Well, how was it?" their mother asked. "Let's put it like this," said Eddie. "We're through with women for a while." Those ponies never forgave the boys for that 14-mile ride. They had never considered themselves beasts of burden, but there was one thing they could bear: a grudge. They were the orneriest ponies for miles around, and they had a mind of their own. When you wanted them to go left, they turned right. When you had in mind a nice trot up the holler, they would turn tail and head home, often throwing the boys head first over their tails. One time, Eddie was out for a ride with his brother Scotty. They followed the road a mile around the hillside to the next small town called Blooming Rose. There, they turned around and headed for home. Something about the idea of home always seemed to inspire those ponies. The road around the hillside was mostly dirt and gravel. However, there were spots where the county had paved it. Those were the places where it dropped steeply into a holler, jumped a culvert, and pulled a couple of G's through a tight curve and up the opposite hill. As Eddie and Scotty approached home, they had to dip through one last holler, and it was here that Eddie's pony got the going home itch. It started to pick up speed and broke into a trot along the gravel straightaway. As he hit the pavement at the top of the hill, Eddie pulled back on the reins. Without a saddle, it was a little tricky to stay on a pony, especially on one that was trotting downhill. His pony ignored him. In fact, it picked up speed, breaking into a gallop. As the pony's nose tilted down the hill, Eddie's nose followed. The pony stretched its neck out and flattened its ears to its head. With each stride, Eddie felt himself sliding inch by inch up over the pony's withers. "Whoa! Whoa, you dang mule!" shouted Eddie. He could just as well have been speaking Mandarin. Halfway down the hill, Eddie was sliding over the pony's shoulders. It just ran faster, and with a sickening sense of impending doom, Eddie felt himself falling over to one side. He managed to keep a leg over the pony, but the only thing he could do was to reach up around its neck and hold on for dear life. There he was, traveling upside down at high speed over a coarse asphalt surface. Every time the pony took a step, it would knee Eddie in the back. Whappity-whap, whappity-whap. Eddie looked up into the foaming mouth and nostrils of his assassin and prayed for a miracle. His body was aching. His fingers were losing their grip. In a moment that felt like an eternity, Eddie finally had to let go. He hit the pavement doing 40 miles an hour and started his long skid down the hill. That's when the pony decided to tap dance on his ribs. Instead of going around Eddie, the pony went right over him, leaving some lovely bruises in the shape of horseshoes. When Eddie slowly picked up what was left of himself off the pavement, he realized that half of his prayer had been answered. He was still alive. Now he would just wait to see if the pony dropped dead in answer to the other half. Well, the boys got so fed up and beat up by the ponies, they decided to get a horse. It was a small horse, mind you, perhaps a bit too small because it still thought and acted suspiciously like a pony. Its name was Ron. He was a beautiful, small pinto horse with bold patches of color. In order to house him, the boys had to modify a pre-existing chicken coop, turning it into a small barn. They put a manger in one end and left room on the other end for a little wooden door, just big enough for Ron to pass under. The boys took turns feeding and watering Ron. Now, feeding him was no problem. Just give him a bat or two of hay and a half can of his favorite food, sweet feed. But watering him was another story. Because there was no running water at the house, or anywhere on the hilltop for that matter, the boys had to lead Ron around the hillside about a quarter of a mile to a place where there was a spring. After doing it a few times, it became quite a chore. The other big chore was scraping out the barn each week. The boys were too lazy to fling the manure very far, so over time it stacked up around the barn to the depth of a foot or two. One day it was Eddie's turn to feed and water Ron. He ducked inside the narrow door and grabbed a bat of hay. Then he opened a feed sack and fished out half a coffee can of sweet feed. Now Ron was crazy about sweet feed. He forgot all about the hay and started rooting around in the feed box with delight. Eddie still had to take Ron out to the spring, and he didn't have all day to wait for Ron to relish his oats. He clipped a rope to Ron's halter and dragged him away from the feed. Ron went reluctantly, looking longingly back over his shoulder at the little barn. After a few minutes, they arrived at the water hole. Ron dropped his head to drink. While he was drinking, Eddie had an idea. He knew exactly where Ron wanted to go when he finished drinking, back to his feed box. There was no bridle and bit for Ron, but Eddie figured he didn't need one. That horse was going back to the barn, so why should Eddie walk back when he could ride? Without waiting for Ron to finish drinking, Eddie threw his leg across Ron's back and climbed aboard. He figured that when Ron had had enough to drink, he'd turn around and amble home. Wrong. As soon as Eddie let go of the lead rope, Ron jerked up his dripping head, spun on a dime, and lit out down the path as fast as he could go. He put his ears back, stretched out his neck, and thundered along the path, sending clods of dirt flying into the brush. Eddie had never ridden so fast in his life. He was certain to be killed. Thinking quickly, Eddie realized that when they reached the yard, there was a downhill stretch where Ron would probably slow down enough for Eddie to leap off. He figured a broken leg would beat a broken neck. But no, when Ron hit the yard, he just ran faster. Eddie looked up and saw the narrow gate leading into the barnyard. Ron always slowed to a walk when he passed through that gate. Eddie figured he'd jump for his life when Ron slowed down. But no, when Ron hit the gate, he only ran faster. In the half second after Ron passed through the gate, Eddie looked up and saw the tiny barn door, just big enough for Ron to pass under. He was sure Ron would finally slow down to enter the barn, and he could at last leap off. But no. Ron had only one thing on his mind: sweet feed. He hit the barn doing 90 miles an hour, and Eddie hit the barn wall over the door at the same speed. Ker-splat! Ron slid out from under Eddie. Eddie sailed spectacularly off of Ron. He flailed his arms in the air as he fell spread eagle on his back. He could have been seriously hurt, except for one thing: horse manure. Eddie landed ker-splat on a deep cushion of smelly horse manure. He waited while the stars stopped spinning, and then he sat up and checked himself out. His arms worked. His legs seemed to work. His spine didn't appear to be broken. He breathed a sigh of relief, wiped some horse hockey from his face, and looked to heaven. With a smile of gratitude, he thanked God for horse manure. He owed it his life.